All right, to discuss more, we're now joined live by national security expert James A. Russell from Ontario, California. Thanks so much for joining us. Glad to have you on our broadcast. Now, Iran has now hit these U.S. bases. The first one it hit is in Iraq, the Erbil International Airport. Where do you think is this leading to? Do we see a greater escalation?
I think the question is the degree to which Iran maintains enough of an arsenal to keep their side of the bombardment going. President Trump in his presentation claimed that the United States had decimated or significantly reduced the ballistic missile force in Iran as a result of the American and Israeli strikes. And in this kind of, I guess I'll call it war, it will basically continue until the sides get low on ammunition. And I don't know what Iran's ammunition stockpiles look like. But be that as it may, the same is also true for the Israelis and the United States. In other words, neither party in this three-ringed sort of bargaining framework have limitless supplies of these munitions. Now, it is also the case, of course, that Iran has developed this capacity for what we would call asymmetric warfare, which is to say it draws upon the use of irregular forces and militia to strike their enemies in unforeseen kinds of ways. I would expect, for example, that Iran is going to draw upon all of the tools in its proverbial arsenal as a means of response to these attacks. And I think it's a great mistake for the Israelis and the Americans to blithely assume that Iran has been somehow weakened and they're not capable of making creative responses to these long-range strikes. In fact, I would argue that one of the sort of characteristics of the United States, certainly over the last quarter-odd century in its many wars across the Middle East, is that we have always underestimated our enemies. And they turned out to be much more resourceful and resilient than we gave them credit for. And that the war, therefore, is not going to be finished in a week, which is, of course, what President Trump has sort of suggested, I think.
And talking of Trump, he also announced he had declared the death of Khamenei hours before Iran state media had confirmed it. So that was somehow, we would say, was goal. And then he talked about the Iranians to take over the government. When it comes to Israel, they have been attacking these generals. So what is the end goal of Israel and U.S. in this war? What is the U.S. looking forward for with Khamenei gone?
You know, this is the $64,000 question. Which is, what is the relationship between the use of force and your objectives? And can you achieve those objectives through the use of force? It should be the elementary sort of calculation that any political leader should engage in, of course, upon deciding to use force. And I think it's clear in this particular case that the United States, in particular, President Trump, is taking his lead from the Israelis. We've launched this war. This war is occurring because the United States has been pressured by Israel, and Israel wants to see Iran destabilized internally, and it would like the country to split apart, to sort of become balkanized, if you will, in the hopes that this would weaken Iran. And I think this represents a grave misreading of Iranian culture and history. As I'm sure your viewers are aware, Iran is one of the oldest countries in this part of the world. They're one of the most ethnically heterogeneous countries in the world, and there's a very strong sense of national identity and national purpose. It's a strong nation state. And I think it represents a grave, kind of misunderstanding of Iran's strength and its resiliency. To think that a few bombs is going to somehow cause the whole thing to sort of collapse like a house of cards. Um, and I should hasten to add one more thing, that this typically has been one of the main selling points, a mistaken selling point, of course, of America's use of force across this part of the world over the last quarter century, which is that by which I mean the idea that, oh, the enemy is weak and they're a house of cards waiting to collapse, and all they need is a little push, and the enemy will all run away because we're so strong and they're so weak. And the last quarter century tells us that that hasn't worked and it's not the case. But the Israelis, I think, are really driving the train on this. I don't think President Trump has any kind of nuanced view of what the United States seeks in the region. He's really just doing this. The United States is engaged in this war because Netanyahu demanded that he do it. And American foreign policy in the region is regrettably run by the Israelis and the Israeli government and the Israeli lobby in Washington, D.C. And it's embarrassing for me to have to say this, but there was no groundswell for this war in the United States. This is all come as a result of Israeli pressure.
Right. Also, let's talk about Khamenei. You talked about Iran being, one of the oldest, establishments. When we talk about the Iranian regime with Khamenei gone, this is something that even during the 12-day war, somehow they had already announced the names were out who was going to replace Khamenei when he went into hiding. At this point of time, how do you assess the Iranian regime? How do you think that they will be able to keep that kind of a regime that Khamenei was? And how do you assess this whole hierarchy in the Iranian regime?
Well, of course, we don't know the answers to these great questions of yours, which is to say, what's the resilience of the constitutional form of government and the institutions that have been set up pursuant to that constitution that was part of the system that Ayatollah Khamenei established when he put together the constitution. But what that essentially means, to try and unpack it a little bit, is that this is a state, a ruling government of institutions. And as you well know, in a country yourself, you have many different kinds of governing institutions that are full of smart and capable people. And in Iran, those institutions don't necessarily look the way they do in the United States or in India, but they are there nonetheless. And they're staffed with plenty of people and who are capable and professionals. And, for example, this was several years ago, Trump assassinated the head of the Iran Revolutionary Guard, General Soleimani, if you remember, at the Baghdad airport. And this is just an example. So there was, of course, in the West, everyone was, it's really disgusting to think of the degree to see the degree to which you see people cheering the deaths of fellow human beings. But when Soleimani was killed, everybody in the West on the news shows was, oh, isn't this wonderful? We've removed this critical leader. But in the Iranian system, there are many people who could take Soleimani's place, and they did. And there was no diminution in the capabilities of the IRGC when General Soleimani was killed, or at least it didn't look that way to me. And so here we have this another situation on a broader scale, which is that what is the resilience of these kinds of institutions to keep the regime functioning? Now, I would hasten to or I would caution against, again, the idea that these institutions are brittle, they don't have resilience, they can't adapt in wartime. And as I say, it's not. I think that the regime is overwhelmingly popular at home, but the if we sort of look back, at examples of this, people in countries tend to come together when their countries get attacked by external enemies. And in the Iran case, for example, I don't want to bore your viewers with this too much, but we can't underestimate, for example, the role of the Iran-Iraq War, a war which goes on for 10 years that consolidates the revolution in Iran once the Shah is dispensed with. And so I would caution against this idea that the regime is not going to continue to be able to function because a few bombs and missiles, however well aimed they might be, are going off.
But at the same time, we know that Israel is still attacking, these military ballistic missile sites, so to say. So considering the fact that of course, we don't really know the numbers yet now, but how long can this war be prolonged? It's the exhaustion that we're thinking of, because Israel just came out from the Israel-Gaza war, where they're still trying to figure out peace there because there's still attacks in Gaza. On the other hand, there's this Iran and IRGC, who is now already has attacked U.S. bases. How big of this conflict can it become at this point?
Well, the first thing I would say that Israel gets all its ammunition from the United States, right? It comes from my tax dollars, regrettably, I might add. But the point of this is that the United States and the Israelis will need to reload at some stage of the game. And the Iranians, they're fighting closer to home, right? In fact, their supply lines are their country. It's right there. And they have other means of striking back at their enemies. It's not just long-range missiles, right? They have proxies, they have militias, they have asymmetric warfare. And I would, again, also, I shudder to think of these kinds of possibilities, but we in the West and the Israelis, we are greatly kind of impressed by these gun camera footages that we sort of see going off, and we think, oh, well, this must mean we're blowing all these things up, and that must mean that we are winning. And of course, what determines victory in war is weapons are important. There isn't any way to say that they're not, but it's political will, right? Which is the more important thing in a war, and in which any war, of course, is attritional. So, question sort of that and again that I have to ask myself is, what happens if there are a series of unanticipated attacks inside Israel or unexpected attacks on political leaders? We in the United States and Israel like to think that we're immune from these things and that we can wander around the world shooting off missiles and assassinating whoever we want. But what happens when the other guy figures out a creative way to start shooting back at us and inflicting the same kind of damage on us? It creates all this sort of escalation potential that can quickly spiral in ways that political leaders increasingly would have difficulty controlling. So when we talk about the escalation of conflict, of course, what we're really talking about is the ability of political and military leaders to control that escalation. And also, I think President Trump and the Israelis are under the mistaken assumption that just because they have these fancy long-range missiles and they're very accurate, that they can maintain a control on escalation. And so it's a cautionary tale that once the shooting starts, war creates escalatory dynamics all of their own that political leaders cannot necessarily control. They get swept along by events. They don't control them. And that's the scenario we find ourselves today in, I would respectfully suggest.
Understood. Well, I would request you, Mr. Russell, just to stay with us for a while. We know what happens after Khamenei is gone. Let's brief on that. I will come back to you on this really quick.